Barbarians, chapters 13, 14, and 15, Steel, Smoke, and Silence. Through these fields of destruction, baptisms of fire, I've witnessed your suffering, as the battle raged higher. And though they did hurt me so bad in the fear and alarm, you did not desert me. My brothers in arms, dire straits, brothers in arms. For hours, the various media outlets had been preparing the triumvirate citizenry for a major announcement from the government. Given the heightened state of tensions, many individuals felt a certain sense of trepidation, for there had been no warning as to the topic, though no one doubted that it must have something to do with the war. When the time came, almost everyone was glued to their view screen, waiting with apprehension as Minister Leandra Singh appeared, with the other ministers and senior military personnel in the background. "My fellow citizens," she began, her image and demeanor exuding gravitas, "I come before you this evening to deliver an announcement, one that affects every member of our society. At 0700 hours, local time, triumvirate forces engaged the enemy at Hewholooksskyward." Utter silence filled the chamber where she spoke, as she was sure it did in almost every location where the broadcast was being heard. "At this time, we have no other information," she continued, "though I can assure you as any new data comes in, we will update you immediately." She paused for a moment as her features softened. "We ask that you pray for our sons and daughters in their hour of need, for they require our strength now, more than ever." The task force that approached the Konim fleet was something very different than the ad hoc collection of freighters that had been annihilated here, weeks before. The ships were utilitarian at best, with a rough, unfinished appearance, but unlike the freighters, they had been designed for battle from the keel up. "All pilots to their ships!" the intercom blared, as human and Ophiptera alike raced to their comet fighters. The Pegasus carriers that transported them into battle were stripped-down affairs, little more than engines and rails to secure the tiny craft, with minimal life support. The aviators climbed aboard their tiny craft, sealing themselves in as the carriers slowed at the edge of the engagement area. One by one, the lights turned green as each ship signaled their readiness. Admiral Fujimoto stood on the carrier Bellerophon's bridge, her hands clasped behind her back. For this operation she had to be here, and as she saw the enemy fleet beginning to react to their presence, a grim smile appeared on her face. They'd pored over the imagery of T.F. Odysseus's crushing defeat, learning everything they could, and the results of every lesson had gone into planning for this one, though Murphy had made his presence known once again. The Ronin contingent had run into unexpected delays, and because of that she'd almost scrubbed the mission. But the hidden scout ships posted at the outskirts of the system had reported signs the enemy was making preparations to depart, and that had forced her hand. "Let's hope they get here in time," she thought to herself, as she touched an icon on her console. "Bellerophon, actual to all fighters. Remember, you'll need to get in close to the enemy ships to stay under their guns. Your objective is to cripple their ships, not destroy them, so once you've done enough damage to slow them down, move on to the next one. Whatever you do, do not let yourselves get pinned down. The comets have the advantages in speed and agility, so use that." Her almond eyes grew dark and cold. "You've all seen the images. You know what these same ships did to T.F. Odysseus. Those brave men and women are watching us now, so let's make damn sure their deaths were not in vain." She took a deep breath and said, "All units, launch! Launch! Launch!" The comets detached in pairs, forming up by squadron before accelerating towards the enemy. The carriers themselves raced for safety once their fighters were away, mounting no offensive weaponry. They were sitting ducks for the enemy ships, which were already beginning to respond. Diakshjiaj. Guyaz studied the images closely as the attacking vessels closed in. These new ships were nothing like the ones the enemy had used before, and he had a hard time imagining such tiny craft would have anything more than a minimal effect to his fleet. But perhaps they knew something he did not. "Alert the fleet," he ordered. "Open fire the instant they are within range." "Raptor leader to all squadrons," Group Captain Mustafa Malone announced on the fleet frequency. "Stick close to your wingman and keep focus on your objective. Do not let yourselves get pulled away." A predatory grin was plastered on his face as they readied themselves for their attack run. "Tally-ho!" he howled, diving into the fray, just as the enemy ships exploded with deadly aimed fire. The comets bobbed and weaved, jinking around the sky as a hail of cannon and missile fire clawed up to meet them. Their agility was their greatest advantage, and that was an area in which the Ophioptera excelled. Just as the human had suspected, being descended from flying creatures had given them an immense advantage when it came to spatial awareness and reflexes. Their success wasn't total, however. The sheer amount of fire being thrown at them was too much to dodge completely, as the comets began to die. In ones and twos they disappeared from the display, and yet they did not return fire. The tiny ships were knife fighters, not snipers, and to do any damage at all they had to get in close. Admiral Fujimoto watched the plot as the comets plunged towards the enemy, holding her breath as they did their best to evade the hail of death being thrown at them. They had to clear a pathway in, if the follow-on forces were to have a prayer of making it through the blockade. The smile on Group Captain Malone's face was long gone, as the enemy fire slowly but steadily winnowed down his ships. The comets were dying by the handful now, as they closed the distance, but they grimly held their course as they came screaming in. So close. Just a little more. And then... "Raptor leader to all squadrons! Scatter!" he shouted, as the fighters peeled off in a dozen different directions, confusing the enemy. It took the big ships a few seconds to adjust aim, and by the time they did, it was already too late. The comets opened fire, their cannons hurling their projectiles against the hulls of the enemy ships. Unlike the missiles used by TF Odysseus, these weapons would not be so easily dissuaded. There were no sensitive electronics to fry, and they flew straight and true as the fighters peeled away as the first antimatter rounds detonated, ripping great rents into their hulls, the passageways and compartments suddenly exposed to space. Oathkeeper bucked as a round landed amidships. The damage was severe but not crippling, as Diaksh Guyaz prepared to show these meddlesome creatures who ruled in this place once and for all. "Fire capacitors!" he shouted, as 100 ships sent a massive EMP energy burst against the tiny fighter craft. Only this time it was the comets who shrugged off the attack, as all around him his fleet began paying the price. The attacking fighters tore a hole into the enemy fleet, as a thin smile appeared on Admiral Fujimoto's face. The loss of TF Odysseus had been a painful one, but it had shown them how the enemy fought. In retrospect, they should have anticipated an EMP attack, but a century of peace had deprived them of a great deal of institutional knowledge. In a way, they were having to relearn how to fight all over again, despite the guilds and the reenactments. There were some things only war could teach, and the lessons were proving deadly. But the fighters had done their job. Admiral Fujimoto switched to a new frequency and contacted the ships waiting on the periphery of the battle zone. "Fleet Admiral to second wave, the way is clear. Begin planetary drop!" Nassat clutched his rifle as the shuttle screamed towards the planet's surface. Bravo Company was packed in tightly, so much so he could scarcely breathe. In a way, that was a comfort. Having his herd pressed in close was a reassuring sensation for his kind, though the humans scattered among them seemed to feel otherwise. Of course, they weren't a herd species. He had no idea what was happening outside the confines of his shuttle. There were no windows, no monitors, no message traffic being forwarded to their helmets. Nothing. Were they winning the battle? Losing? Who knew? There was only thing he did know. One hit was all it would take to kill everyone on board. Perhaps it was better not being able to watch. He glanced over at Reichret, waiting as calmly as someone meeting a friend for lunch. They had talked late into the night after Sergeant Lin had left, and while they had gotten to know each other quite a bit better, he still could not say he knew her. There were large parts of her she kept walled away, and the times he'd tried to inquire, he'd bounced off an impenetrable wall. He could only imagine the amount of pain it would take to make her close herself off so completely, and yet... Nassat shook his head, looking away. This was not the time to be thinking of things other than what awaited them on the surface. A sharp jolt slammed him against his neighbors, as several cried out in alarm. Part of him wanted to do the same. But what good would it do? Either they would reach the surface, or they would not. There was nothing he could do to influence the outcome, so best he simply focus on the task at hand instead. Sergeant Lin stood at the front of the shuttle, a look of grim determination plastered on his face. He acted as if the strangeness of that evening had never taken place, and in truth Nassat was glad for it. Was it possible the humans felt the same fear he did? It was not a question he could ask them, and what's more, he did not want to. For if the predators were afraid, What hope was there for any of them? Another sharp jolt, and he glanced towards Rykret once more, only to find her staring back at him. He tried to smile for her to give her some sense of ease, but it was like gazing on a blank wall. Had she disappeared so completely inside herself, there was nothing left? Nasat prayed that was not so, but as he struggled to find some way to reassure her, Sergeant Lin's booming voice interrupted his thoughts. 1 minute out, he shouted over the din. When the ramp drops, get the hell away from the shuttle. You let yourselves get bunched up and you're just asking for it. Nasat closed his eyes and whispered a fervent prayer. Creator, I beg you watch over us, he implored as Lin spoke up again. 30 seconds. Lock and load. His hands shook as he readied his weapon, as the reality of what was coming threatened to overwhelm him. But the months of training took over, and despite the trembling in his fingers, they knew what to do. Another deep, cleansing breath, and then wham! The shuttle slammed hard onto the ground as the ramp dropped a split second later. Go! Lin screamed, as Nasat charged blindly out of the cramped space along with the others. Straight into hell. Death will take those who fight alone, but united we can break a fate once set in stone. Just hold the line until the end. Cause we will give them hell, I will never surrender. Will free the earth and sky, crush my heart into embers, and I will reignite Maluka. Reignite! Diaksh Giaj Guyaz growled hungrily as the triumvirate fighters swarmed over his fleet. They were slowly grinding them down, but his own ships were paying a terrible price for every craft destroyed. Retribution and Reciprocity were drifting, their main systems offline, and a dozen more were in little better shape. Their guns simply weren't designed for such small, swift ships, and unless he acted quickly, he would be forced to withdraw, leaving the cripples behind. Giaj punched a button on his console. All ships form a protective bubble around our most damaged warcraft. Do not let the enemy's fighters find a way in. It was not a formation they had practiced, but at the moment it was the best he could do. Once his fleet formed an impenetrable wall, then let them come. He'd grind them under his heel like insects. Admiral Fujimoto watched the enemy fleet fall back into a defensive formation and wished for the life of her she had even a handful of real warships. A dozen or so battle wagons and she'd smash her way through their perimeter, and there'd be damn all they could to do to stop her. But wishing would not make it so. She had what she had, and that would have to suffice. At least the enemy had ceded the initiative to her, and if she could keep them penned up and out of the fight, her forces on the ground might just have a chance. Tapping an icon on her display, she radioed the fighters. Bellerophon actual to Raptor lead, pull back your fighters. Harassment and interdiction only. Keep them boxed up, but do not engage unless they attempt a breakout. It was a standoff, at least for the moment. But if the enemy realized just how vulnerable her carriers were and risked a counterattack, her fighters would be unable to refuel and rearm. Disaster loomed on a razor's edge, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to prevent it. Nasat almost froze in shock as the rank in front of him were mowed down like grass. Their blood splattered his uniform as he stumbled over their bodies, pushed from the rear as the Sortor behind him bolted in near panic. Keep moving! Sergeant Lin screamed, firing as he charged forward. You stay here, and you're dead. Incoming mortars exploded all around him as he ran for his life, diving for an impact crater just as a round detonated behind him. The blast threw him off his feet, slamming him into the loose soil and knocking the breath out of his lungs. He'd lost his grip on his weapon, and in a moment of panic he scrabbled about to find it, as another soldier landed in the hole beside him. It took him a moment to realize it was a human who had dove into his shell crater, and a brief glance to his helmet's HUD display informed him it was Sergeant Vadas. Thank the Creator, he whispered fervently as he reached out and grabbed her shoulder. What do we do now, Sergeant? He shouted, desperate for someone, anyone, to take charge and show him the way. Sergeant Vadas rolled over on her back, her blank eyes staring up at the sky, with a large, ragged hole ripped through the middle of her chest. Nasat recoiled in horror, staring at her corpse. The humans were supposed to be invulnerable, and if they could die as easily as his own people, this entire war was nothing but folly. It took him several moments to get his fear under some semblance of control. Of course, the humans were as mortal as he was. It was just that they seemed so much larger than life during training. Unstoppable, unflappable, with a predator's courage. In some hidden part of his brain, he'd assumed they would lead them through safely. And now, They cannot save you, his mind whispered frantically. You must save yourself. He swallowed nervously, ducking back into his crater as another explosion rocked the ground. He couldn't simply sit and cower in his hole. If he did nothing, he was as good as dead himself. Sergeant Vada still clutched her rifle, and with a whispered apology he pried it from her dead fingers, lifting it to his shoulder. It felt wrong in his hands, as it was designed for a human's frame, but its mechanics were the same as his own. It would do for now, until he could find a replacement, of which he was sure there would be several lying about, ones their previous owners no longer required. The world suddenly seemed to split apart as new explosions rocked the air around him. The second wave of shuttles were coming in, and he realized in alarm they were being shot out of the sky with deadly precision. They were being blown apart one after another, raining flaming debris all around his position. Risking a look, he spotted a crew-served weapon just a few hundred meters away, and as he watched, they loaded another magazine into the launcher. Without those reinforcements, they'd be slaughtered. His hands seemed to move of their own volition as he loaded a grenade into the tube and locked it shut with a hollow-sounding thunk. He peered through the sight, gauging the distance, and fired, dropping back into his crater to reload. Nasat trembled with fear as he dared a second look, and was filled with disquiet as he saw that he'd missed. His round had fallen short by several meters, and had not harmed the weapon or its crew at all. It had, however, gotten their attention. Nasat yelped and ducked for cover as a hail of weapons fire peppered his position, clutching his rifle tightly. The enemy knew exactly where he was, and they wanted him dead. Not just anyone, him! He couldn't risk another attempt, he just couldn't. But if he didn't, those shuttles would be destroyed, and then they'd kill him. Die now or die later. Is this what war is? His mind wailed. Admiral! The officer monitoring sensors shouted. We have incoming! New ships entering the system! Helene's head snapped around. Enemy reinforcements? She asked in sick realization. There was a pause, and then a grin appeared on the officer's face. Negative. It's the Ronin contingent! Thank God, her mind whispered. Reports from the surface were not good. The small perimeter they'd managed to secure was in danger of collapse, and they still hadn't managed to knock out the enemy's anti-air capabilities. What's their ETA? She demanded. 20 minutes, Admiral, the comm officer confirmed. Tell them to expedite, she ordered. 20 minutes. A mere blink of the eye, and possibly far too late to save them. Another shuttle exploded in a fireball overhead as Nasat closed his eyes. He had to do something. Letting those humans and Sortars die without trying to save them was tantamount to killing them himself. There are worse things than dying, he realized suddenly. Nasat took a deep breath and double-checked his weapon. Creator, help me now, he prayed, as he leapt from his shell crater and charged the gun position, firing his grenade before switching to the rifle, spraying the surprised enemy with a hail of weapons fire. One of them managed to return fire, and Nasat felt something tug at his arm as he swapped magazines, firing again. The last enemy survivor went down as he galloped through the objective, whipping his weapon back and forth in search of targets, before he realized they were all either dead or dying. Nasat breathed a sigh of relief as he sank slowly to the ground, pulling off his helmet to wipe the dirt and smoke from his face as his eyes suddenly went wide. He'd heard the phrase moment of clarity mentioned during training, but he'd never truly understood it, not until that moment. He was alone, no support, behind enemy lines. This is so very bad, his mind gibbered as he logged on to the comm network for the first time since they'd landed. Bravo 6 Actual, this is Bravo 2-3, he all but cried out into the mic. Have secured enemy anti-air weapon position, requesting instructions, over. He got out in a rush. Sending coordinates now. There was a moment's pause, and then, Bravo 2-3, where is Bravo 2-6? Lynn demanded. 2-6 had been Sergeant Vadas's call sign. Dead, Nasat whispered. Bravo 2-6 is dead. Copy 2-3. Lynn replied after a moment. Stand by your position. We're coming to you, over. Copy 6 Actual, Nasat acknowledged as he scanned the perimeter for movement. At first he saw nothing, but then a small contingent of Swartors boiled up out of the ground, charging forward, with a human in the lead. He whispered a silent prayer as he waved them forward, freezing in shock as he saw movement coming from the opposite direction. An enemy unit must have realized what had happened and was coming to deal with them, and without thinking he opened fire, sending them diving for cover. Lin and the others arrived moments later, hugging the dirt, as the enemy opened up with everything they had. "Sit rep!" Lin shouted as he and the others returned fire. "Sergeant Vadas is dead!" Nasat shouted back. "I saw the enemy shooting down our shuttles, and I took the position to stop them." Sergeant Lin stared at him for a moment. "By yourself?" he asked in amazement. Nasat suddenly felt embarrassed. "I had to, Sergeant," he said uncomfortably. "There was no one else." An odd expression appeared on the human's face. "Enjoy your moment of glory," he shouted as he switched magazines. "Unless reinforcements get here soon, no one will ever know." An incoming flight of mortars cut off his reply, as Nasat focused on just staying alive. He tried to scratch out a few inches of dirt in between assaults as the enemy charged their position. They managed to beat them off the first time, but they quickly regrouped and tried again. This time they got closer, as several of his fellow Sortors died defending the barren patch of dirt they were desperately using for cover. He could hear the sound of incoming shuttles, but he didn't dare spare them a glance. His entire life had become just a handful of actions, repeated over and over again. Fire, switch magazines, scratch out a little more dirt, fire again, pull a wounded comrade to safety, fire, switch magazines. The rest of the world simply disappeared. There was nothing else in his universe other than the desperate struggle to stay alive. And then, a new sound managed to penetrate his consciousness. At first it barely registered, but as it grew louder, the sound of crashing objects and clanking metal was impossible to ignore. But those sounds were not the ones that finally drew his attention. Nasat stared at Lin in confusion. "Is that music?" he asked in bewilderment. Sergeant Lin's grin was the slasher smile of a madman. "No! That's Panzerlied!" he whooped with glee, jumping up out of his hole, as a massive metal beast roared past their position, firing a gigantic weapon that obliterated the enemy's position. "About time you Ronin bastards showed up!" Lin howled, as the tanks clattered their way forward. "I was struck by lightning. Walking down the street, I was hit by something last night in my sleep. It's a dead man's party. Who could ask for more? Everybody's coming. Leave your body at the door. Leave your body and soul at the door. Don't run away. It's only me. Don't be afraid of what you can't see. Oingo boingo. Dead man's party." The arrival of the Ronin armor turned the tide, as the enemy scrambled to fall back. Nasat and the others struggled to keep up as the massive tanks surged forward, their speed only limited by the terrain and the raw power of their engines. He had seen the artificial life forms in a variety of body shapes over the years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for anything like this. Their mammoth turrets swept across the battlefield, destroying everything in their path, as Nasat and his fellow Saurtowers felt a wave of relief wash over them. With the tanks at their side, the battle would surely be over in a matter of days, perhaps even hours. It was cause for celebration. But as they cheered and clapped each other's flanks, one of the armored vehicles suddenly exploded, sending a pillar of fire 100 meters into the sky. 2 more died seconds later, and suddenly it was the panzers that were in full retreat. "God damn it!" Sergeant Lin screamed in frustration. "I told those stupid Ronin bastards to wait for support!" Nasat could only stare in shock. "Sergeant, what happened?" he asked shrilly as he watched his hopes for a quick end to the war come crashing down. "Ambush!" he snarled, stomping his feet. "The enemy lead them right into a trap." He turned to look at Nasat. "Never assume your opponent's an idiot, Nasat," he warned him. "It's the surest way to end up dead." "Yes, Sergeant," he said quietly, as yet another tank went up in flames. Diaksh Jiaj, Guyaz waved his engineer forward as he studied the plot on his console. "What is the status of retribution and reciprocity?" he asked him. "We can return retribution to operational status in just a few hours," the engineer informed him. "Its speed will be greatly reduced, as will its firepower, but it will be functional. Reciprocity is more problematic. While we can repair its engines in short order, at least in a limited capacity, it has been holed in multiple locations. It will be unable to sustain life until those have been sealed, and even once that has been accomplished, we have detected a number of radiation leaks. Diaksh, I believe it is best if she were scuttled," he finished. Jiaj grimaced at the news, though he was not actually surprised. The engineer had merely confirmed his own worst suspicions, and despite his overwhelming numerical advantage, the loss of the two ships hurt badly. He suddenly snarled, pounding his console in frustration. He had to break free of the cage the enemy held him in. The human forces, and he knew now this new force must be human, or at least led by them, would allow him to escape. He was certain of that. But that would leave the warriors on the planet without support. Eventually, they would be forced to surrender, and that could not be allowed to happen. They represented the bulk of his fighting force, and he would not abandon them to their fate. His eyes studied the plot once more, searching for an answer, when a possible strategy suggested itself to him. His eyes narrowed as he manipulated the data, adjusting the parameters, as a thin smile appeared on his face. The Diaksh turned back to his engineer. "I have something a bit different in mind," he told him in conspiratorial tones. "Now here's what I wish you to do." Admiral Fujimoto stared at the enemy's formation and wondered what her counterpart was thinking. He couldn't stay there forever, that much had to be obvious to him, which left only two options: escape or breakout. If he decided to withdraw, she would happily allow him to do so, for that would leave the enemy on the ground at her mercy. But as canny as her opponent had proved thus far, she was certain that was the last thing on his mind, which meant he had to be planning a breakout. That being the case, he had two possible strategies that would give him a chance to preserve his forces. He could use the bulk of his fleet to cover an evacuation of the planet, and then attempt an escape, but that was a risky proposition at best. As soon as she spotted any shuttles heading for or leaving the planet, she'd send in the fighters. They could operate in atmosphere, whereas his big ships could not, and the comets would wreak havoc on anything as slow and defenseless as a shuttle. Or, he could send an advance force against her carriers. There was risk there as well. She'd already shown him what her fighters could do against his ships, but of the two options it was the smarter play. So how exactly would he do it? She was still mulling that over when her comm officer signaled for her attention. "Admiral, I have flash priority traffic. Eyes only, heavily encrypted." Helene arched an eyebrow. "Send it to my monitor," she ordered, as she waited for the download and the decryption protocols to finish. Her eyes narrowed as the message appeared in the clear, drumming her fingers on the console absent-mindedly as she read the brief communiqué, before sighing heavily as she leaned back in her chair. This was going to be a complication, but then she'd prepared for the possibility. "Get the ground commander on the horn," she ordered, "and tell him there's been a slight change in plans." Nassat ducked into the medical tent, his eyes searching through the gloom. Row after row of cots were lined up in the temporary structure, each one filled with a wounded Swartor or human. The healers were moving with purpose, doing their best to save as many lives as they could, but even to his neophyte eyes he could see they were overwhelmed. The moans and cries of the wounded were heart-wrenching, but worse still were the silent forms that made no sound at all. They were stacked to one side out of the way, and as many bodies as he saw, he knew there were many more still waiting to be found. The very sight of it should have reduced him to agonized tears, and the fact that it didn't spoke volumes at just how much death he had already seen. He froze as he spotted the person he'd been searching for, making his way through the maze of wounded until he touched her on the shoulder. Raikret wearily looked up at him, her smock splattered with the blood of a dozen different soldiers. Her eyes softened as she recognized him as she rose to her feet. "Nassat, I am pleased you are still alive," she told him, though her eyes quickly narrowed as she stared at his arm. "You are wounded," she said flatly, reaching for her kit. He blinked in confusion. "No, I am fine," he tried to reassure her, but as she grasped his arm and lifted it up, he realized it was streaked with blood. "What? When did that happen?" he wondered aloud as she started to clean and dress the wound. "You are fortunate it is not serious," Raikret said with a ghost of a smile. "I am surprised Sergeant Lin allowed you to come here. We have been forced to make the lesser cases wait." Nassat shook his head. "That is not why I came," he told her. "Sergeant Lin sent me to fetch you. He said we required a healer, though he did not say why, only that we would be briefed upon our return." Raikret shook her head. "I am needed here," she protested as she finished securing the dressing. "We are already understaffed. Apparently, you have been attached to him for some reason." He shrugged. "I have already passed the orders to your superior." He flexed his arm a few times and smiled. "Thank you," he told her. "It feels much better already." She nodded slowly as she peeled off her smock and pulled on her uniform jacket. "I sincerely hope this will be worth it," she said coldly. "Many will not survive without my presence here." "Sergeant Lin would not take you from your duties without good cause," he assured her, as they made their way out of the tent. It was only a short distance to where Lin was waiting, and fortunately they didn't have to bound from crater to foxhole along the way. With the arrival of the armor, the lines had finally stabilized, despite the losses, and now both sides seemed to be digging in for the duration. A tense quiet seemed to hang over the small compound, threatened to explode once more at the drop of a pin. In only a few minutes they arrived where Lin was waiting. "Good, you both made it," he nodded. The rest of Bravo Company, the ones still alive, glanced over at them as they waited to hear what was going on. "We've been tasked with a mission," Lin informed them, coming straight to the point. "A group of friendlies are caught behind enemy lines, and we've been ordered to bring them back out." Rykret looked up sharply. "Do you know who they are?" she asked in a sudden burst of emotion. Lin shook his head. "No idea, just that it's important." "Apparently they're holed up in an abandoned building here," he informed them, making the location on their HUD displays. "The mission is simple. We go in, secure the friendlies, and bring them back. Nice and easy." He paused for a moment, looking over the group. "Due to our losses, 3rd Platoon gets folded into 1st, and I'll be taking charge of that platoon directly. Since we lost Sergeant Vadas, Corporal Nassat will be taking over 2 Circumflex End Platoon." Nassat stared at him in confusion. "But I'm only a private," he corrected him. Lin just chuckled. "Not anymore," he smirked. "I need someone who can think on their feet, and that's you." Nassat's mind spun wildly at the sudden change in circumstance. He looked over at Rykret for support, but she simply returned his gaze with an appraising eye, while saying nothing. "Yes, Sergeant," he mumbled, still dazed by the unexpected promotion. "All right then, saddle up. We do this quiet, people, in and out. Any questions?" No one raised their hand. "You're on point, Nassat," Lin ordered. "Move out." Night was already falling as Bravo Company made their way through friendly lines, past the tanks guarding the perimeter. Nassat desperately wished one was coming with them, but then quiet was the one thing the massive machines were not. He'd asked Lin about that, but the sergeant had shook his head and made some vague reference to bomb magnets, whatever that meant. Rykret hung back with Lin and 1st Platoon while he moved carefully through the barren terrain, his eyes sweeping back and forth as he searched for any sign of the enemy. The rest of the company followed behind him, their weapons out as they too watched for movement. But for once, fortune smiled upon them, and soon they arrived short of their destination, without having stumbled across any of the alien attackers. Sergeant Lin called a halt as he signaled ahead. Nassat waited nervously. The entire mission had gone entirely too smoothly for his liking. The entire planet was crawling with enemy warriors, so where were they? He hunkered down behind small rocky outcropping as Lin verified the friendlies were still there, when all of a sudden a hail of gunfire came out of nowhere, cutting down 6 of his platoon in the first salvo. "Take cover." "Return fire!" Lin shouted as Bravo Company opened up, their weapons searching for the enemy. He spotted them on his HUD with the night vision optics, but they were in a well-covered position. There was no way they'd be able to dislodge them, not without reinforcements, or taking heavy casualties. They lobbed grenade after grenade with their launchers, missing only by centimeters in some cases, but it might as well have been by a kilometer. Nassat hurriedly checked his map, even as Rykret was up and moving, treating the wounded. She was horribly exposed, and he desperately searched for a nearby unit close enough for a fire mission, but there was nothing close enough to respond in time. He was tempted to send another prayer to the Creator skyward, but part of him wondered if perhaps he had already received his allotment of miracles. Something whistled past his ear, quickly followed by another. Nassat threw himself to the ground as the fire whipped past his position. But as he suddenly realized the fire was heading towards the enemy, not coming from it, he also noticed it was rapidly slacking off as well. One by one, the enemy guns went silent, and as he stared in amazement while he rose shakily to his feet, he spotted a small group heading towards their position. His rifle whipped around to cover the new threat, just as Sergeant Lin reached him and pushed his weapon down. "Those are our friendlies," he informed him, as he breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He watched as what appeared to be 4 humans draw closer, dragging along with them what had to be an enemy prisoner. In less than a minute they arrived at their position, as a blonde-haired human female cradled a long gun in her arms. "You're late," Tango said flatly.